The dust kicked up as Grace Garrison's trembling fingers clutched the foreclosure notice. Her father's debt now hers to bear, a burden as heavy as the dark clouds gathering on the horizon over the small town of Lead, South Dakota, in the spring of 1876. Grace stared at the document in disbelief. $3,000, a sum so vast it might as well have been the moon. Her father had been dead barely a week, the consumption finally taking him after months of suffering. The doctor's bills had piled up, and now the bank was calling in the loan on their modest homestead just outside of town. "You have until Friday," Mr. Harrington, the bank clerk, had informed her with practiced detachment earlier that day. "Mr. Blackburn says he's been more than patient." Maxwell Blackburn, Lead's only banker and the wealthiest man in Lawrence County. His name alone sent a chill through Grace's body. 38 years old, never married, with cold eyes that always lingered too long whenever she came to town, Grace tucked the notice into her pocket and continued down the main street. At 22, she had never imagined she'd be alone with such a burden. Her mother had died years ago, and with her father now gone too, the 15 acres they'd worked so hard for would soon belong to the bank. She stopped before the general store, catching a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her green eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The black mourning dress hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost weight since her father fell ill. "Miss Garrison." The deep voice startled her. She turned to find Quentin Farrow leaning against the hitching post, his hat tipped low over his eyes. At 26, he was known throughout the Black Hills as one of the most skilled wranglers and horse trainers in the territory. He'd moved to Lead 2 years prior, working odd jobs and breaking horses for the mining companies and local ranchers. "Mr. Farrow," she acknowledged with a small nod. "I was sorry to hear about your father." His voice was genuine, softer than his rugged appearance suggested. "He was a good man." "Thank you." She offered a polite smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She didn't know Quentin well, only that he rented a small cabin at the edge of town and kept mostly to himself. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked, straightening his tall frame. The sun glinted off his dark blonde hair as he removed his hat respectfully. "That's kind, but no," Grace replied, unwilling to burden anyone with her troubles. "I should be getting home before dark." Quentin watched as she walked to her wagon, a small frown forming between his brows. There was something in her demeanor that troubled him. He'd always noticed Grace Garrison, it was hard not to. Unlike the other young women in town who flaunted themselves at socials and church gatherings, Grace carried herself with quiet dignity. Even now, clearly burdened, she held her head high. "Miss Garrison," he called, striding toward her wagon. "I'm heading out to the Peterson place tomorrow. If you need anything from town while I'm passing by, I'd be happy to stop." Grace hesitated, touched by the simple offer. "That's thoughtful, Mr. Farrow, but I'll manage." As she drove away, Quentin couldn't shake his concern. Something was wrong. He'd seen the way Maxwell Blackburn watched her in town, like a wolf eyeing a fawn. The next morning, Grace stood in the small kitchen of her homestead, counting out the meager savings her father had hidden in an old coffee tin. $117, not even close to what she needed. She knew what people would say. Sell the homestead and move on. But this land was everything her parents had worked for after coming west. The thought of losing it felt like losing them all over again. A knock at the door startled her. Hastily, she covered the money and smoothed her skirt before opening the door. Maxwell Blackburn stood on her porch, dressed impeccably as always in his black suit, a gold watch chain draped across his vest. His horse and buggy waited beyond the gate. "Miss Garrison." He removed his hat, revealing slick-backed dark hair peppered with gray at the temples. "May I come in?" Grace hesitated but knew she couldn't refuse the man who held her future in his hands. "Of course, Mr. Blackburn." He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the modest but well-kept interior of the cabin. "I wanted to personally express my condolences about your father. James was a valued customer of the bank for many years." "Thank you," Grace replied stiffly, remaining standing even as he took a seat at the kitchen table uninvited. "I trust my clerk informed you of your situation." His voice was smooth as polished stone. "He did." "I understand I have until Friday." Blackburn nodded slowly, tapping his fingers on the tabletop. "It's a substantial sum, Miss Garrison. I don't suppose you've managed to secure it." "Not yet, but I'm exploring options." Her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Options?" Blackburn chuckled softly. "In lead, I'm afraid those are limited for a young woman alone." He rose from his chair and moved closer. "However, I believe I may have a solution that could benefit us both." Grace tensed as he approached, the scent of expensive cologne invading her space. "What kind of solution?" "I've long admired your resilience, Miss Garrison, and now I find myself in a position to offer you security." His eyes traveled over her face in a way that made her skin crawl. "I'm proposing an arrangement. I would assume your father's debt, and in exchange, you would come to live at my home as my wife." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Your wife, indeed. You would want for nothing. My home is the finest in Lead, 3 stories, modern conveniences, a full staff." His voice dropped lower. "And you would no longer have to worry about this modest homestead." The implication was clear. She would lose her home either way. This was merely a transaction to him, her body and freedom in exchange for debt forgiveness. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Blackburn, but I must decline." Grace struggled to keep her voice steady. His smile faltered. "Perhaps you misunderstand, Miss Garrison. Without my intervention, you'll be homeless by week's end. A pretty young woman alone in this territory." He left the sentence unfinished, the threat hanging in the air. "I understand perfectly," she countered, stepping toward the door, "but I will find another way." Blackburn replaced his hat, his demeanor cooling. "I admire your spirit, though it's misplaced. I'll give you time to reconsider. The offer stands until Friday at noon, when the property is scheduled for auction." He moved toward the door. "After that, I'm afraid your options will be considerably fewer." After he left, Grace leaned against the door, her heart pounding. Auction. He hadn't mentioned an auction before. The thought of strangers bidding on her family's land made her stomach turn. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, visiting neighbors to ask about work, only to find that no one was hiring. By sunset, she had returned home empty-handed and desperate. Meanwhile, in town, Quentin Farrow was tying his horse outside the saloon when he overheard a conversation between 2 bank clerks. "Blackburn's got his eye on the Garrison girl," one said, laughing. "Says he's going to foreclose and then offer to marry her to clear the debt." "Poor thing," the other replied. "Better than being thrown out, I suppose, though being tied to Blackburn seems a steep price." The auction's set for Friday noon, though I doubt anyone will bid against the banker, not if they want to stay in his good graces. Quentin's jaw tightened as he led his horse away. He'd had dealings with Blackburn before, none pleasant. The banker had a reputation for acquiring property by any means necessary, often preying on those in desperate situations. The thought of Grace falling into his hands stirred something protective in Quentin. By Thursday, Grace had exhausted all possibilities. No one would lend her money, and the few possessions she could sell wouldn't fetch nearly enough. As dusk settled over the homestead, she sat on the porch swing her father had built, watching the sunset one last time. A rider approached from the west. Even in the fading light, she recognized Quentin Farrow's broad-shouldered silhouette. He dismounted at the gate, leading his horse up the path. "Evening, Miss Garrison," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Farrow," she acknowledged, puzzled by his unexpected visit. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, shifting awkwardly. "I heard about the auction tomorrow." Grace's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "News travels fast in lead." "Too fast sometimes." He stepped closer, his expression serious. "I also heard about Blackburn's proposal." She looked away, humiliated that her predicament was now town gossip. "Miss Garrison, Grace," Quentin continued, his voice gentle. "I know we don't know each other well, but I can't stand by while Blackburn forces you into such a position." He reached into his vest and withdrew a folded document. "I'd like to help if you'll let me." Grace accepted the paper hesitantly, unfolding it to reveal a bank draft for $3,000. "Mr. Farrow, I can't possibly accept this." She tried to return it, but he stepped back. "You're not accepting it outright," he explained. "I'm offering to bid on your property tomorrow and return the deed to you. You can repay me over time, on fair terms, with no interest." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do this for me?" Quentin looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "Your father once helped me when I first came to lead. I was broke, my horse was lame, and he gave me work for a week until I got on my feet." He met her eyes. "I never forgot that kindness." "But this is a fortune," Grace whispered. "How can you afford such a sum?" A small smile crossed his face. "I've been lucky with some investments. Gold claims and horse breeding have treated me well." Grace studied his face, searching for deceit but finding only sincerity in his blue eyes. "Mr. Farrow, I'm grateful beyond words, but I can't involve you in my troubles." "You're not involving me. I'm choosing to help." His voice grew firmer. "Blackburn has taken advantage of too many good people in this town. Someone needs to stand against him." Grace considered his offer. If she accepted, she would still owe the money, but to someone who seemed to have no ulterior motives beyond kindness. "If I agree," she said slowly, "I insist on a proper contract with reasonable payment terms, and I'll pay you back every cent." Quentin nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Of course. We'll draw up terms that work for you." For the first time in weeks, hope fluttered in Grace's chest. "Thank you, Mr. Farrow, truly." "Quentin," he corrected gently. "If we're to be in business together, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Quentin," she repeated, offering a genuine smile. "Then you must call me Grace." They spent the next hour discussing the details of their arrangement. Quentin would attend the auction and bid on her behalf. Once he secured the property, they would establish a repayment schedule based on what she could reasonably afford from future earnings. "I should warn you," Grace said as he prepared to leave. "Maxwell Blackburn won't take kindly to being outmaneuvered. He could make things difficult for you in town." Quentin's expression hardened. "Let him try. I don't bank with him and I don't need his approval." He settled his hat back on his head. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow will be a long day, but you won't face it alone." As he rode away into the darkness, Grace felt a peculiar warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't alone with her burden. She had an ally and perhaps something more. Friday morning dawned clear and cool. Grace dressed carefully in her best dress, a navy blue cotton that brought out the green in her eyes. She couldn't afford to look desperate, even though she was. The auction was scheduled for noon at the courthouse steps, and she arrived early, her stomach in knots. A small crowd had gathered, mostly curious onlookers with a few potential bidders among them. Maxwell Blackburn stood apart, conversing quietly with the auctioneer. When he spotted Grace, a confident smile spread across his face. He approached, straightening his jacket. "Miss Garrison," he greeted smoothly. "I'm pleased to see you here." Have you reconsidered my offer? No, Mr. Blackburn, she replied firmly. I'm here to observe the proceedings. His smile faltered slightly. As you wish, though I should warn you property auctions can be quite competitive. I doubt anyone will challenge my bid, but it's your right to watch your family legacy change hands. The cruelty of his words stung, but Grace maintained her composure. We shall see. At precisely noon, the auctioneer called for attention and began explaining the terms of the sale. Grace scanned the crowd anxiously, but there was no sign of Quentin. Had he changed his mind? As the auctioneer prepared to accept the first bid, her hope began to waver. We'll start the bidding at $1,000 for the Garrison homestead, 15 acres with improvements including a house, barn, and well. Do I hear 1,000? Blackburn raised his hand casually. 1,000. I have $1,000. Do I hear 1,100? The crowd remained silent. Grace's heart sank as the auctioneer prepared to close the bidding, going once at 1,000, 3,000. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Quentin Farrow pushed through to the front, his expression determined. He had cleaned up for the occasion, wearing a pressed shirt and vest, though he still looked out of place among the townspeople. Blackburn's face darkened with surprise and anger. What is the meaning of this, Farrow? The auctioneer cleared his throat. I have a bid of $3,000. Do I hear 3,100? Blackburn glared at Quentin, then at Grace, understanding dawning in his eyes. 3,500, he countered. 4,000, Quentin responded without hesitation. The crowd murmured in shock. Property in Lead rarely commanded such sums, especially a modest homestead with no mining potential. Blackburn's face flushed with anger. 4,500. Quentin met the banker's glare steadily. 5,000. Silence fell over the courthouse steps. The bid was far beyond the property's market value, and everyone knew it. Blackburn's jaw worked as he calculated his options. Mr. Blackburn, the auctioneer prompted, do I hear 5,500? After a tense moment, Blackburn gave a curt shake of his head. His eyes found Grace's, cold with fury and promise of retribution. Very well, the auctioneer declared. Sold to Mr. Farrow for $5,000. The crowd dispersed quickly, sensing the tension between the two men. Blackburn approached Quentin, his voice low and menacing. You've made a serious mistake, Farrow. This isn't over. I believe it is, Quentin replied calmly. The property was fairly won at auction. Blackburn's gaze shifted to Grace. I see how it is. Found yourself a champion, have you? Or perhaps you've simply found a more agreeable arrangement for selling yourself. Before Grace could respond, Quentin stepped between them, his voice dangerously quiet. You'll apologize to the lady, Blackburn. Or what? The banker scoffed. Or I'll forget we're standing on courthouse steps in broad daylight. Despite the softness of his tone, there was no mistaking the threat behind Quentin's words. Something in his expression must have convinced Blackburn of his seriousness, for the banker took a step back. This territory is changing, Farrow. Men like you drifters, cowboys, you're becoming obsolete. Remember that. With a final glare at Grace, he stalked away. Once he was gone, Grace approached Quentin, overwhelmed with gratitude and concern. You paid far more than we agreed. Far more than the property is worth. Quentin's expression softened. I had to make sure he couldn't outbid me. Don't worry, our agreement stands at 3,000. That's all you need to repay. But the extra money is my concern, he insisted gently. Consider it an investment in frustrating Maxwell Blackburn's plans. After completing the necessary paperwork, Quentin handed Grace the deed to her property. It's still yours. It always was. I don't know how to thank you, she said, blinking back tears of relief. You don't need to thank me. Just don't let Blackburn or anyone else push you around again." He glanced at the son. "May I walk you home?" They left town together, leading Quentin's horse along the road to the Garrison homestead. The spring afternoon was pleasant, wildflowers dotting the grass alongside the path. "What will you do now?" Quentin asked as they walked. Grace had been pondering this question since her father's passing. "I need to find work. The homestead produces enough food for me, but I'll need income to repay you and survive." "You have skills," Quentin observed. "I've seen your needlework at church socials, and everyone knows your preserves are the best in the county." Grace smiled at the unexpected compliment. "Perhaps I could sell some preserves and do mending, and the vegetable garden will yield more than I need. I could sell the excess." "You'll manage," he said with conviction. "You're stronger than you realize." When they reached her property, Grace felt a surge of gratitude knowing it was still hers. "Will you come in for coffee? It's the least I can offer." Quentin accepted, tethering his horse to the porch rail. Inside, he looked around with interest. The cabin was modest but meticulously maintained, with handmade curtains and a patchwork quilt draped over a rocking chair. While Grace prepared coffee, Quentin examined a framed photograph on the mantel, a younger Grace with her parents, all smiling. "Your father was proud of you," he said when she returned with 2 steaming cups. "How do you know?" "He mentioned you whenever we spoke. Said you were the smartest person in Lead, man or woman." Quentin accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Grace felt a pang of grief mixed with pride. "He was biased." "Maybe." Quentin's smile was warm, "but I've yet to see evidence to the contrary." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Grace studied him openly for the first time. His face was weathered from years outdoors, but his blue eyes were kind, with smile lines at the corners. His hands were calloused from work, yet he held the delicate coffee cup with surprising gentleness. "Why did you really help me?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please." "My father's kindness doesn't explain a $5,000 bid." Quentin set his cup down, considering his words carefully. "When I first came to Lead, I was running from something, a past I wasn't proud of. Your father was the first person who didn't ask questions, who just saw someone needing work and offered it." He met her gaze directly. "But you're right, that's not the only reason." "Then what?" "I've watched you for 2 years, Grace. The way you care for others, the dignity with which you faced your father's illness." His voice grew softer. "When I heard what Blackburn planned, I couldn't bear the thought of someone like you being forced to marry someone like him." The intensity in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. "That's still a great risk to take for someone you barely know." "Perhaps I'd like the chance to know you better," he admitted, "but that's not conditional on any of this. The deed is yours, the terms stand regardless of anything else." Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with relief over saving her home. "I think I'd like that chance too." The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Grace's life. True to her word, she began selling preserves and offering mending services to generate income. To her surprise, many townspeople sought out her goods and services, some perhaps out of sympathy, but most because of her genuine skill. Quentin visited regularly, often bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, seeds for her garden, or news from town. They established a comfortable routine, with Quentin joining her for Sunday suppers and occasionally helping with repairs around the homestead. As spring turned to summer, their friendship deepened. Grace learned that Quentin had come from St. Louis, where he'd worked for his uncle's shipping company before heading west. He rarely spoke of his family, but she gathered there had been some falling out that prompted his departure. In turn, Grace shared stories of her childhood, of her mother's teachings and her father's dreams for their little piece of land. With each conversation, the initial awkwardness of their arrangement faded, replaced by genuine interest and growing affection. One warm July evening, they sat on her porch after dinner, watching fireflies illuminate the gathering dusk. "I received an interesting proposition today," Quentin mentioned casually. "Judge Williams asked if I'd be interested in purchasing his ranch. He's moving to Denver to live with his daughter." Grace turned to him in surprise. "The Williams place, but that's over 200 acres with a substantial herd." "It is," Quentin agreed, "more than I could manage alone." "Are you considering it?" He nodded slowly. "I've saved enough for a decent down payment. The rest would be on terms." He hesitated before continuing. "It would mean putting down roots here in Lead, permanently." The implication hung between them. Until now, despite his regular presence in her life, Quentin had maintained the aura of someone who might move on when the mood struck. This would change everything. "I think that would be wonderful," Grace said softly. "Lead could use more good men willing to stay." Quentin's gaze lingered on her face, searching for something. "There's one more thing. I'd need help running a place that size. A partner." Grace's heart quickened. "What kind of partner?" "Ideally, one who knows about homesteading, someone good with accounts and planning." His voice grew quieter. "Someone I've come to care for deeply." Grace barely breathed, afraid to break the moment. "Are you asking me to be your business partner, Quentin Farrow?" A slow smile spread across his face. "For now, though I hope in time you might consider a more permanent arrangement." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 3 riders appeared on the road, stopping at her gate. Even in the fading light, Grace recognized Maxwell Blackburn at the center, flanked by 2 men she didn't know. Quentin stood, moving protectively in front of her. "Evening, gentlemen. You're out late." Blackburn dismounted, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Farrow, Miss Garrison, I hope we're not interrupting a private moment." "What can we do for you, Mr. Blackburn?" Grace asked, keeping her voice steady despite her unease. "I've come with a proposition." Blackburn approached the porch steps, but didn't ascend. "The railroad has expressed interest in expanding their line through this area. They've commissioned me to secure certain properties along the proposed route." Grace exchanged a glance with Quentin. "And my property is among them." "Indeed. They're offering well above market value 10,000 for your 15 acres. Blackburn's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Quite a windfall for you, Miss Garrison. You could relocate to Denver or even Chicago with that sum." Quentin's stance remained rigid. "Curious timing, Blackburn. Why would the railroad want this specific parcel when there's open land all around?" "The surveyors have determined this is the optimal route," Blackburn replied smoothly. "Miss Garrison, this is a rare opportunity. You'd be wise to consider it carefully." Grace stepped forward to stand beside Quentin. "Thank you for bringing this offer, Mr. Blackburn, but my land isn't for sale, at any price." Blackburn's facade of civility slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "Don't be foolish, girl. You can't possibly maintain this place alone, and your debt to Farrow must be substantial." "My arrangements with Mr. Farrow are none of your concern," Grace replied firmly. "And I'm managing quite well, thank you." One of Blackburn's companions shifted impatiently. "Let's just get on with it, Max. We don't have all night." Quentin's hand moved subtly toward his side, where Grace knew he carried a revolver. "Get on with what, exactly?" Blackburn sighed dramatically. "I had hoped to resolve this amicably, but you leave me no choice." He signaled to his companions, who dismounted. "These gentlemen work for the railroad. They're authorized to take possession of the property by any means necessary." Grace gasped as one of the men produced a document. "You can't possibly, eminent domain, Miss Garrison," Blackburn explained, his tone mockingly patient. The railroad's development is considered essential for territorial progress. The law permits appropriate seizure with compensation. Quentin stepped forward, his voice deadly calm. That document is fraudulent, Blackburn. The territorial government hasn't granted eminent domain rights to any railroad for this area. I know because I checked before purchasing the Williams Ranch this morning. Uncertainty flickered across Blackburn's face before he regained his composure. "You're bluffing, Farrow." "Am I?" Quentin countered. Sheriff Moss was quite helpful in explaining the proper legal channels for such claims. Perhaps we should ride into town and discuss this with him directly. The two men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not expecting resistance. Blackburn's jaw tightened as he realized his scheme was unraveling. "This isn't over," he warned, backing toward his horse. "The railroad will come through eventually, and when it does, Quentin interrupted, they'll negotiate fairly and legally with property owners. Now, I suggest you leave before I decide your trespassing warrants more direct attention." After a tense moment, Blackburn and his men mounted their horses and rode away, dust swirling in their wake. Grace released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You think they'll return?" she asked quietly. Quentin's expression was grim. "Not tonight, but Blackburn isn't one to give up easily." He turned to her, concern evident in his face. "I don't like the idea of you staying here alone until this is resolved." "I have my father's shotgun," Grace assured him, though the thought of confronting Blackburn and his men alone was terrifying. "That's not enough," Quentin insisted. "I think you should stay in town for a few days, perhaps with Mrs. Collins. She's mentioned needing help at the boarding house." Grace shook her head firmly. "I won't be driven from my home by threats and intimidation. That's exactly what Blackburn wants." Quentin studied her for a long moment, admiration mingling with frustration in his gaze. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Grace Garrison." "I prefer determined," she replied with a small smile. "Determined, then," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If you won't leave, then I'll stay. I'll bed down in your barn until we sort this out." Grace's eyes widened. "Quentin, you can't. People will talk." "Let them," he said simply. "Your safety matters more than gossip." They argued back and forth until reaching a compromise. Quentin would return to town that night but come back the following day to help secure the property. They would also visit Sheriff Moss to report Blackburn's threats. As he prepared to leave, Quentin paused at the porch steps. "About what I said earlier before we were interrupted." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "About partnership?" "Yes." His eyes held her steadily. "I meant every word, Grace. Whatever happens with Blackburn, with the ranch, with anything else, my feelings won't change." Before she could respond, he mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, leaving Grace with a curious mixture of fear and hope swirling in her heart. The next morning, Grace was hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. Tensing, she reached for the shotgun leaning against the porch before recognizing Quentin's bay gelding in the lead. Behind him rode Sheriff Moss, a stocky man with a graying mustache and reputation for fairness. "Morning, Miss Garrison," the sheriff called as they dismounted. "Farrow here tells me you had some unwelcome visitors last night." Grace described Blackburn's visit while the sheriff listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small book. When she finished, he tucked the book away with a frown. "This ain't the first complaint about Blackburn's business practices," he admitted, "but it's the boldest move yet. Impersonating railroad officials is a federal offense." "Will you arrest him?" Grace asked. Sheriff Moss sighed heavily. "It's your word against his, and those men were likely hired hands who have already moved on. But I'll pay Blackburn a visit, let him know I'm watching." He fixed her with a serious look. "Meanwhile, be careful. Men like him don't take kindly to being crossed. After the sheriff departed, Quentin revealed the supplies he'd brought: extra ammunition for her shotgun, a new lock for the back door, and materials to reinforce the windows. "You really think all this is necessary?" Grace asked as they worked. "I hope not," Quentin replied grimly. "But Blackburn has too much influence in this town. Money talks, and not everyone is as honest as Sheriff Moss." They spent the day securing the homestead. As they worked, Grace found herself watching Quentin, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence with which he approached each task. She had grown accustomed to his presence over the past months, but today felt different. Perhaps it was his declaration the previous evening, or the way he'd unhesitatingly positioned himself between her and danger. By late afternoon, they had done all they could. Quentin insisted on checking the barn and outbuildings before leaving, ensuring everything was safely locked. "I still don't like the idea of you staying here alone," he said as they walked back to the house. "I'll be fine," Grace assured him, though she felt less confident than her words suggested. Quentin stopped, turning to face her. "Grace, there's another option we haven't discussed." "What's that?" He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Marry me." Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What, marry me?" he repeated, more firmly this time. "Not just for protection, though that's part of it. Not just for the ranch, though we'd make good partners." He took her hands in his. "Because I love you, Grace. I think I have since that first day your father hired me and you brought lemonade to the fields." Grace's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Quentin, you don't have to answer now," he continued quickly. "I know it's sudden. But with everything happening, I needed you to know how I feel, what you mean to me." Grace studied his face, the earnestness in his blue eyes, the nervous set of his jaw. This wasn't like Blackburn's cold proposal, a business arrangement dressed as marriage. This was something else entirely. "It's not sudden," she said softly. "Not really." Hope flickered across his features. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've been falling in love with you too, Quentin Farrow, a little more each day." The admission made her feel both vulnerable and strangely powerful, but marriage is a serious step. "And with everything happening with Blackburn, all the more reason not to wait," he argued gently. "Together we're stronger. The Williams Ranch, your homestead, we could join them, build something lasting." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "I'm not asking out of convenience or protection, Grace. I'm asking because I can't imagine my future without you in it." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. After months of grief and uncertainty, after nearly losing everything, the possibility of happiness seemed almost too much to bear. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Quentin, I'll marry you." Joy transformed his face as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. When he set her down, he cupped her face gently between his calloused hands and kissed her, a tender, questioning kiss that deepened as she responded. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I should still stay in the barn tonight," he murmured. "At least until we can speak with the Reverend." Grace nodded, though reluctantly. "Tomorrow we'll go to town together. Make it official." That night, despite knowing Quentin was just a shout away in the barn, Grace found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of the future marriage, the ranch, the life they would build together. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would accept Quentin's proposal, but she would also insist on maintaining her independence. Their marriage would be a true partnership, not the subservient arrangement society often expected. She was preparing breakfast when a commotion outside drew her attention. Through the window, she saw smoke rising from the direction of the barn. Heart racing, she grabbed her shawl and rushed outside. The barn was ablaze, flames licking up the wooden walls, black smoke billowing into the morning sky. "Quentin!" she screamed, running toward the inferno. Before she could reach it, strong arms caught her from behind. "Grace, stop!" "It's too dangerous," she whirled to find Quentin, face smudged with soot but very much alive. "You're all right, thank God." She threw her arms around him, shaking with relief. "I was checking the horses when I smelled smoke," he explained, holding her tightly. "Barely got them out in time." Grace pulled back to look at him. "Who would do this?" Quentin's expression darkened. "3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count." They watched helplessly as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. The horses, thankfully unharmed, grazed nervously at a safe distance. "This changes things," Quentin said grimly. "Blackburn's escalating. Next time it could be the house with you inside." Grace nodded, her initial shock giving way to cold anger. "We need to go to town. Now. Not just to see the Reverend, but to confront Blackburn directly." "Confronting him could be dangerous," Quentin warned. "Staying here is dangerous," she countered. "I'm tired of being afraid, Quentin. It's time we take the fight to him." They rode into Leeds side by side, Grace on her father's old mare, Quentin on his gelding. The town was bustling with its usual morning activity, miners heading to their shifts, merchants opening shops, women gossiping near the general store. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where they reported the barn fire. Sheriff Moss listened gravely, making notes but offering little hope of proving Blackburn's involvement. "Arson's hard to prove without witnesses," he explained apologetically. "But this, combined with your report yesterday, gives me cause to question Blackburn officially." From there, they proceeded to the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Thompson, a kindly older man who had presided over James Garrison's funeral, welcomed them warmly. "Marriage," he repeated when they explained their purpose. "Well now, that's happier news than I usually receive these days. When were you thinking?" "As soon as possible," Quentin replied, taking Grace's hand. The Reverend raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on their haste. "I could perform the ceremony Sunday after services, if that suits." "That would be perfect," Grace said, squeezing Quentin's hand. As they left the church, Quentin suggested Grace wait at Mrs. Collins' boarding house while he confronted Blackburn. "Not a chance," she replied firmly. "We do this together or not at all." The bank was housed in a 2-story brick building at the center of town, by far the most imposing structure in Leeds. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with polish and paper. The clerk behind the counter straightened nervously when they entered. "We need to see Mr. Blackburn," Quentin stated, his tone brooking no argument. "You have an appointment?" the clerk asked weakly. "Tell him Grace Garrison and Quentin Farrow are here. He'll see us." The clerk scurried away, disappearing through a door marked private. Moments later he returned, nodding reluctantly. "This way, please." Maxwell Blackburn's office was exactly what Grace expected: ostentatious, with heavy furniture and expensive decorations designed to intimidate visitors. The banker himself sat behind a massive desk, his expression one of practiced surprise. "Miss Garrison, Mr. Farrow, what an unexpected pleasure." He gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Please sit." "We'll stand," Quentin replied coldly. Blackburn shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "As you wish. What brings you to my establishment?" "Our barn was burned to the ground this morning," Grace said, meeting his gaze directly. "We both know you're responsible." Blackburn's expression remained impassive. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Garrison." "Do you have any evidence to support it?" "We don't need evidence," Quentin interjected. "This is a warning, Blackburn. Stay away from Grace, from her property, and from me. Whatever scheme you're planning ends now." A thin smile spread across the banker's face. "Or what precisely?" "You'll report me to the sheriff. You've already done that, I understand, yet here I sit." He straightened papers on his desk dismissively. "The truth is, you have nothing. No witnesses, no proof, just suspicions." "We have more than you think," Grace said steadily. "We have each other. And after Sunday, we'll have the law on our side as well." Blackburn's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sunday? We're getting married," Quentin announced, placing a protective hand at the small of Grace's back. "Our properties will be joined legally, as will our lives. Any action against one of us is an action against both." For the first time, Blackburn appeared genuinely startled. He recovered quickly, however, his expression hardening. "How practical of you, Miss Garrison, trading one debt for another, it seems." "The only debt in my life is the one I'm repaying Quentin," Grace replied, "on terms that were fairly negotiated and documented. Unlike your business practices, Mr. Blackburn." "I would be careful making such insinuations," the banker warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Especially given your precarious circumstances." Quentin stepped forward, his patience visibly thinning. "Enough threats, Blackburn. We came to make one thing clear. Whatever happens to Grace or her property from this point forward will be traced directly back to you. Sheriff Moss is already investigating the barn fire. Judge Williams, whose ranch I now own, sits on the territorial court and has no love for you either." The mention of Judge Williams caused Blackburn's confident facade to slip momentarily. "You're bluffing. Williams left for Denver weeks ago. After selling me his ranch and introducing me to his friends on the territorial council," Quentin countered smoothly. "You've made enemies, Blackburn, powerful ones. Push us further and you'll find yourself facing them all." A tense silence fell over the office. Grace could almost see Blackburn calculating his options, weighing the potential cost against his desire for revenge. Finally, he spread his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "It seems congratulations are in order for your upcoming nuptials. I wish you both every happiness." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual bank business to attend to." Outside, Grace released a shaky breath. "Do you think he'll back down?" "For now," Quentin replied, guiding her away from the bank. "Men like Blackburn only understand power and consequences. We've shown him both." "But you didn't really speak with Judge Williams about this, did you?" A slow smile spread across Quentin's face. "Not specifically. But I did purchase his ranch legally, and he did mention his distaste for Blackburn's methods before leaving. The rest was implied." Grace laughed despite herself. "Quentin Farrow, you're more cunning than you appear." "Only when necessary," he assured her, taking her hand. "Now we have wedding preparations to make and a homestead to rebuild." The days leading up to Sunday passed in a whirlwind of activity. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Lade, eliciting mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Collins and Sheriff Moss, offered genuine congratulations. Others whispered about the hasty nature of the union and speculated about Quentin's motives in marrying a woman with significant debt. Grace tried to ignore the gossip, focusing instead on practical matters. She and Quentin decided she would move temporarily to the Williams Ranch after the wedding while they determined the best use for both properties. The barn would need rebuilding, but that could wait until they were settled. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Grace dressed carefully in her mother's wedding dress, which Mrs. Collins had helped alter to fit her slimmer frame. The cream-colored silk was simply cut but elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. The church was surprisingly full when she arrived. It seemed many townspeople, whether supportive or simply curious, had decided to stay after the regular service to witness the wedding. Quentin waited at the altar, looking both nervous and handsome in a new suit. His eyes widened when he saw her, a smile spreading across his face that erased any lingering doubts she might have harbored. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and protect one another for the rest of their days. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, eliciting a few good-natured cheers from the congregation. As they turned to face the church, Grace's gaze fell on a figure at the back, Maxwell Blackburn, watching with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly before he turned and left without a word. "Don't let him spoil this day," Quentin murmured, noticing her distraction. "He can't," she assured him, squeezing his hand. Nothing could. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Collins had organized a small reception at the boarding house, where friends and well-wishers gathered to congratulate the newlyweds. There was cake and punch, music from a local fiddler, and more genuine goodwill than Grace had experienced since her father's passing. As the afternoon waned, they thanked their guests and prepared to depart for the Williams Ranch, now the Farrow Ranch. Grace reminded herself with a mixture of pride and wonder. "Ready, Mrs. Farrow?" Quentin asked as he helped her into the wagon. The new name sounded strange but right. "Ready, Mr. Farrow." The ranch was located 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with a well-built main house, several outbuildings, and extensive pastureland. As they approached, Grace took in her new home with growing excitement. The 2-story house was larger than her cabin but still modest, with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. "What do you think?" Quentin asked, watching her reaction carefully. "It's beautiful," she replied honestly, "but it will need a woman's touch." He laughed, pulling the wagon to a stop before the house. "That's exactly what Judge Williams said when he showed it to me." Before she could respond, Quentin circled the wagon and lifted her down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her toward the house. "Quentin," she protested, laughing. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my wife over the threshold," he explained, nudging the door open with his foot. "It's tradition." Inside, the house was clean but sparsely furnished, with plain curtains and functional furniture. Quentin had clearly made an effort, though fresh flowers stood in a vase on the dining table and new linens adorned the beds. "I know it's not much compared to what you had," he said as he set her down in the main room. "It's perfect," Grace assured him, turning slowly to take it all in. "And it's ours, that's what matters." Quentin stepped closer, his expression suddenly serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Grace, something I should have mentioned before." A flicker of unease passed through her. "What is it?" He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This arrived yesterday from my uncle in St. Louis. I wrote to him after purchasing the ranch, explaining my situation." Grace accepted the paper with trepidation, unfolding it to reveal a bank draft for a sum that made her gasp. $10,000. "Quentin, what is this?" "My inheritance," he explained. "My father died 5 years ago, leaving his shipping business to my uncle with the provision that my share would be held until I demonstrated sufficient maturity and stability." His words, not mine. A wry smile crossed his face. "According to my uncle, purchasing a ranch and getting married qualifies." Grace stared at the draft, then at Quentin. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "Because I wanted you to marry me for me, not for financial security." He took her hands in his. "I wanted to prove to myself as much as to you that I could provide for us without relying on family money. So all this time when you were helping me with the debt, the money I used to purchase your property was mine, earned through honest work," he assured her. "This inheritance only arrived yesterday. It changes nothing about why I married you, Grace." She studied his face, finding only sincerity in his blue eyes. "What will we do with it?" Quentin smiled, relief evident in his expression. "That's for us to decide together. Rebuild your barn, expand the ranch, set some aside for the future, our future." The implications of his words settled over Grace like a warm blanket. For months, she had lived with uncertainty and fear. Now, in the space of a week, everything had changed. She had a husband she loved, a home that was secure, and prospects brighter than she could have imagined. "Our future," she repeated, stepping into his embrace. I like the sound of that. Their first weeks of marriage were a blend of adjustment and discovery. Grace learned the rhythms of the ranch, while Quentin learned the intricacies of sharing his life completely with another person. There were minor disagreements: Grace's insistence on maintaining some independence, Quentin's occasional tendency to make decisions without consultation. But these were overshadowed by the genuine joy they found in building a life together. They decided to use part of the inheritance to rebuild the barn on Grace's homestead, which they would maintain as a separate property for now. Another portion was invested in expanding the ranch's cattle operation, with the remainder set aside for future needs. As summer turned to fall, they fell into a comfortable routine. Quentin managed the ranch operations with the help of 2 hired hands, while Grace oversaw the household and continued her preserves business, which had grown more profitable under her dedicated attention. News from town reached them periodically. Maxwell Blackburn had been unusually quiet since their wedding, focusing his attention on other ventures. Some whispered he was planning something significant, while others suggested he had simply moved on to easier targets. One crisp October morning, Sheriff Moss rode out to the ranch with unexpected news. "Blackburn's been arrested," he announced as Grace served coffee at the kitchen table. "Federal marshals took him in yesterday." Quentin leaned forward, surprised. "On what charges?" "Fraud to start," the sheriff replied, sipping his coffee appreciatively. "Apparently, he's been issuing fraudulent railroad bonds for months. When the territorial governor got wind of it, he called in the federal authorities." Grace and Quentin exchanged stunned glances. "Will it stick?" Grace asked. Sheriff Moss nodded grimly. "From what I hear, they found enough evidence in his office to put him away for years. He'll be transported to Denver for trial next week." After the sheriff departed, a weight seemed to lift from their shoulders, one they hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. "It's really over," Grace murmured as they stood on the porch, watching the sheriff ride away. Quentin wrapped an arm around her waist. "It is. Though I suspect Blackburn's downfall had little to do with us in the end." "Sometimes justice finds its own path," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. With Blackburn's threat removed, they focused fully on building their future. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and by the following spring, they had doubled their cattle herd and added a small but productive apple orchard. In April, as wildflowers bloomed across the hills surrounding Lead, Grace shared news that would change their lives once more. "I've been to see Dr. Wilson," she told Quentin one evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built for her birthday. "We're going to have a baby." The joy that transformed his face was something Grace would remember forever. Quentin lifted her gently from the swing, spinning her in a careful circle before setting her down to kiss her thoroughly. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "When?" "November, the doctor thinks." She placed his hand over her still flat stomach, "just in time for Thanksgiving." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. They converted one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and adding a crib Quentin crafted himself. Grace sewed tiny garments while Quentin expanded his business contacts, determined to build a legacy for their growing family. On a snowy November evening, after a surprisingly easy labor, Grace gave birth to a healthy son they named James Quentin Farrow, in honor of her father. As she watched Quentin holding their child, his expression a mixture of awe and fierce protectiveness, Grace felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. "He's perfect," Quentin whispered, gently stroking their son's cheek with one finger. "Just like his mother." Grace smiled tiredly. "I think he has your eyes." "Poor child," Quentin joked, though his own eyes shimmered with unshed tears. As winter settled over the Black Hills, the Farrow household settled into a new rhythm centered around their son. James was a good-natured baby, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. The challenges of new parenthood, sleepless nights, constant feedings, moments of overwhelming responsibility were balanced by the indescribable joy of watching their child grow and thrive. By the following spring, with James nearly 6 months old, they made a decision about Grace's homestead. Rather than selling it, they would develop it as an extension of their ranch, using the land for crops that would supplement their cattle operation. "It feels right," Grace said as they walked the property one mild March day, James bundled securely against Quentin's chest. "My father would be happy to see his land still in the family, still productive." Quentin nodded, understanding the importance of honoring her family's legacy. "We'll make it something he would be proud of." They were surveying the site for the new barn when a rider approached from the direction of town. Grace recognized Mrs. Collins' son, Billy, urging his horse at a gallop. "Mr. Farrow," he called, reining in sharply. "Ma sent me to fetch you." "There's a man in town asking for you, says he's your brother." Quentin stiffened, his expression closing. "I don't have a brother." Billy shrugged, uncertain. "Well, he says he is. Been staying at the boarding house since yesterday. Says it's urgent family business." After a brief discussion, they decided to return to town together. Whatever this visitor wanted, they would face it as they had faced everything else together. The man waiting in Mrs. Collins' parlor bore enough resemblance to Quentin that Grace immediately recognized the family connection. He was slightly shorter with darker hair, but the same blue eyes and strong jawline. Quentin said flatly, shifting James in his arms. "This is unexpected." The man Quinn stood, his gaze moving from Quentin to Grace, then to the baby. "Hello, brother, it's been a while." 5 years, Quentin agreed, his tone neutral. "This is my wife, Grace, and our son, James." Quinn nodded politely to Grace. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion, but when Uncle Henry mentioned Quentin had settled in Dakota Territory, I thought it was time to mend fences." Quentin's expression remained guarded. "What do you want, Quinn? I doubt you traveled all this way for a family reunion." A flash of hurt crossed Quinn's face. "Actually, that's exactly why I came. Father's been gone 5 years now. Isn't it time we put the past behind us?" The tension in the room was palpable. Grace gently took James from Quentin's arms. "Why don't I take the baby for a walk while you two talk?" she suggested. Mrs. Collins mentioned needing help with something in the kitchen. Quentin hesitated, then nodded, squeezing her hand gratefully. As she left the room, she heard Quinn say, "She seems lovely. You've done well for yourself, brother." An hour later, Quentin found her in Mrs. Collins' garden, where she was showing James the spring flowers beginning to bloom. "Everything all right?" she asked, noting the complex emotions playing across his face. Quentin sighed, sitting beside her on the bench. "Quinn wants to invest in the ranch, says he's tired of the shipping business and wants to try something new." "And you don't believe him?" "I don't know what to believe," he admitted. "We didn't part on good terms. There was a disagreement about the business after Father died. Accusations were made." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But he seems sincere about wanting to reconcile." Grace considered this new development thoughtfully. "What does your heart tell you?" Quentin was silent for a long moment. That everyone deserves a second chance, that holding on to old grievances only poisons the present. He looked at her, a small smile forming. That family is too precious to throw away. She returned his smile, leaning against his shoulder. Then perhaps you should give him that chance. Cautiously, but honestly. Quinn stayed in lead for a week, gradually breaking down the walls between the brothers. Grace watched as Quentin's initial suspicion gave way to cautious acceptance, and finally to genuine pleasure in his brother's company. By the time Quinn departed, they had established the framework for a partnership that would allow him to invest in the ranch while remaining based in St. Louis, where he would serve as their business representative. "Thank you," Quentin said as they watched Quinn's stage depart, "for encouraging me to listen to him." Grace shifted James in her arms. "Family is important. I want our son to know his uncle." "You're remarkable, Grace Farrow," Quentin said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you know that? I've had some indication," she replied with a smile. "You've mentioned it once or twice." He laughed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they turned toward their home, built on love, trust, and the courage to face whatever came their way together. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. The ranch thrived under their joint management, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in Lawrence County. Grace's preserves business grew into a small but profitable venture, with her products sold as far away as Rapid City and Deadwood. Quinn visited regularly, becoming a favorite uncle to James and, 2 years later, to his sister Alina Grace. The partnership between the brothers strengthened with time, allowing them to weather the economic fluctuations that affected the territory. Lead itself changed as the mining operations expanded, and the railroad finally did arrive, though not through either of their properties. The town grew more civilized, with better schools, more churches, and fewer saloons. Grace became active in community affairs, particularly the establishment of a proper school where James and Alina would eventually receive their education. On a warm summer evening in 1883, 7 years after they had first stood together against Maxwell Blackburn, Grace and Quentin sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. James, now 6, was teaching 4-year-old Alina how to lasso a fence post, both laughing as the rope continually missed its target. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Grace asked, her hand finding Quentin's. "If you hadn't been in town that day, if you hadn't overheard those clerks talking." Quentin considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I look at what we've built together, the ranch, our family, our life, and I can't imagine any other path." Grace leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Nor can I." As the sun began to set, painting the Black Hills in shades of gold and purple, Quentin pulled her closer. "I love you, Grace Farrow, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. They had come so far from that dusty courthouse steps, where a desperate banker had tried to claim her future, and a determined cowboy had outbid him. The deed to her homestead, framed and hanging in their study, was more than just a legal document. It was the beginning of their story, the first page in a book they continued to write together, day by day, year by year. As twilight deepened into night, they called the children in for supper, closing the door on a day ending much like countless others before it, with family, with love, with the quiet certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, just as they always had. And in the end, that was the greatest fortune of all.